Ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, we are standing before a moment that history will recount many times, not merely as a bold military operation, but as a deeply dangerous geopolitical precedent in the Western Hemisphere. When I look at the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his transfer to Brooklyn to face charges, I do not see the satisfaction of victory, but rather the immense burden of responsibility and the unpredictable consequences waiting to explode. We must step back to place this event in its proper historical context rather than being swept away by the sensational headlines outside. This is not simply about executing justice or counter narcotics, it is an act of regime change by direct force, reminiscent of the 1989 invasion of Panama to seize Manuel Noriega, yet with risks and complexities multiplied manifold. Throughout my career, from the Central Intelligence Agency to the Pentagon, I have always held that removing a dictator is the easy part, but managing the power vacuum he leaves behind is the true nightmare. A nation does not operate like a light switch that we can flick on or off at will. And the illusion that the United States can step in and run Venezuela immediately is a strategic naivety that could prove fatal. The cold, hard truth we must face right now is that the United States has made a move that cannot be retracted and has wagered the credibility of its entire military and intelligence power on this gamble. Intelligence indicates that a clandestine CIA team infiltrated Venezuela in August to gather vital data for this past Saturday's pre-dawn raid, proving this was not an impulsive decision but a calculated plan with risks equivalent to the operation that killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan in 2011. However, the price was not cheap, as Venezuelan officials report that up to 80 people, including soldiers and civilians, were killed in the raid. And a large part of Mr. Maduro's security detail was completely decimated. Although no American service members were killed, blood has been spilled, and this will create deep scars in the regional psyche. We have cut off the snake's head, but the body of that snake remains and is thrashing in the chaos. Bringing a sitting head of state to a federal court in New York on drug trafficking and weapons charges is a heavy blow to the prestige of adversaries, but it simultaneously raises massive questions about legitimacy and national sovereignty and international relations that we cannot ignore. We need to analyze the reaction from Caracas more deeply because this is where the political chess game is most intense. Acting President Delcy Rodriguez initially reacted with characteristic anger, characterizing the United States' actions as a barbarity and accusing us of only wanting to seize their natural resources. However, in less than 24 hours, that tone shifted astonishingly when Ms. Rodriguez unexpectedly called for dialogue and peace rather than war. Why was there such a rapid transformation from someone considered the right hand of the old regime? The answer lies in the ruthless, pragmatic thinking of power. When she sees her predecessor sitting in a jail cell in Brooklyn, the survival instinct kicks in stronger than any ideology. Miss Rodriguez and the remaining elite in Caracas understand that their protective umbrella has vanished, and they are standing before the gun barrel of the world's number one superpower. So this softness is not a sign of a change of heart, but a desperate effort to buy time. This is when we see most clearly the fragility of authoritarian regimes when facing existential pressure, because loyalty often evaporates very quickly when the price becomes too high. However, what concerns me most is not the reaction of Venezuela, but the chaos in strategic messaging from Washington itself. President Trump stated that the United States intends to run Venezuela and reclaim oil interests for the foreseeable future. Yet at the same time, Secretary of State Marco Rubio suggested we do not plan to govern directly, but only to apply pressure. This contradiction not only confuses allies, but creates opportunities for enemies to exploit. Because in diplomacy, ambiguity is a double-edged sword, but contradiction is poison. When the president says we are in charge and threatens neighboring Colombia with harsh rhetoric, he is inadvertently pushing the entire region into unnecessary confrontation. Threatening Colombian President Gustavo Petro and calling him a sick man while we need Colombia's cooperation to stabilize the border with Venezuela is a fundamental strategic error. We cannot simultaneously want to stabilize Venezuela while antagonizing key regional partners and hope everything goes smoothly. Foreign policy based on imposition and public threats may bring short-term satisfaction to the crowd, but it will sow seeds of long-term instability that future generations will have to bear. Let us look at the oil factor, because this is the undeniable center of gravity in the current administration's thinking. As President Trump has made clear his desire to open Venezuela's vast oil reserves to American companies, Mr. Rubio also focused on opportunities for American businesses, but we must be realistic about the state of this industry. Venezuela's oil infrastructure has been devastated after years of mismanagement, so restoring it requires billions of dollars in investment and years of effort. It is not as simple as changing the leader to make the oil flow. Furthermore, publicly declaring the goal of seizing a sovereign nation's resources is a deadly mistake in strategic communication because it awakens the ghosts of imperialism in the memory of Latin Americans. Instead of being welcomed as saviors, American companies could become targets for sabotage by nationalists or remnants of the old regime. We must remember that the legitimacy of any new government in Venezuela will depend on whether they are seen as representing the people's will or just Washington's puppets. If we are too impatient in exploiting economic benefits, we will lose the chance to build a sustainable political foundation. The pragmatic solution for the current situation is not grand declarations about taking over the country, but a controlled and cautious power transition strategy. We need to leverage the current fear of the Venezuelan leadership to force them to the negotiating table, but the goal is not revenge, but establishing a roadmap for free and fair elections. The United States should coordinate closely with international organizations to create a monitoring mechanism rather than acting unilaterally as an occupying force. There needs to be a conditional amnesty for old regime officials willing to cooperate to avoid backing them into a corner and turning the country into a battlefield of armed factions. In the case of Mr. Maduro and those arrested, justice must be executed transparently and follow due process to prove this is the rule of law and not political retribution. Most importantly, we must restrain aggressive rhetoric toward Colombia and neighbors, because the stability of Venezuela cannot be separated from the stability of the entire Andean region. Finally, I want to remind all of us about the cost of intervention and the burden of power. When we see images of Venezuelan exiles celebrating and hoping to return home, we must also see the potential risks of a prolonged civil war if the transition fails. 80 lives lost in this past raid are a painful reminder that every political decision is paid for in blood. No victory is free, and the arrogance of power often leads to inescapable quagmires, as we have witnessed in many places around the world. The mission of the United States now is not to rule Venezuela like a colony, but to act as a responsible superpower, helping a collapsing nation find its footing without causing further pain to innocent people. That is the hardest path, but it is the only path to ensure long-term national interests and preserve our dignity on the international stage. Ladies and gentlemen, the answer is certainly that we are not done yet, because What I just presented in the previous section was merely the outer shell of a geopolitical time bomb that is far more complex. To truly understand the severity of the problem and reach the depth of a strategic level lecture, we need to dissect the deeper layers of military structure as well as the energy economic equation that the current administration is deliberately simplifying. Um, a regime change never ends when the gunfire stops or when a dictator is handcuffed. That is only the beginning of a much more dangerous and expensive phase called nation building. We cannot stop at general observations, but must go deep into every vein of the Venezuelan patient to see how far the necrosis has spread and whether the United States potent medicine will save the patient or kill them right on the operating table. Therefore, I will continue to dive into detailed analysis of internal security aspects and the reality of the oil and gas sector so we are not lulled to sleep by empty optimistic declarations. Following this is a specialized analysis of the post-war military and security equation because this is the factor determining the survival of any new administration in Caracas. We must look straight at the truth that the Venezuelan military is not a monolith, but a collection of factions held together by economic interests and mutual fear. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez has defiantly declared that Mr. Maduro's government still holds power, but behind those tough words is extreme panic as he realizes that a large part of the most elite security team was destroyed in the raid. When the snake's head is cut off, how the remaining body, comprising thousands of high-ranking officers holding weapons and smuggling routes, will react is the million-dollar question the Pentagon must answer. The existing danger is not a conventional war between the U.S. military and the Venezuelan army, but the disintegration of that country's military into warlord fiefdoms or heavy weapon-wielding criminal gangs. If this happens, Venezuela will not become a democracy, but will turn into a second Somalia right in America's backyard. And that is a national security nightmare no border wall can stop. We also need to expose the illusion of quickly restoring the Venezuelan oil industry as a money printing machine to pay for reconstruction. President Trump and Senator Rubio are painting a rosy picture where U.S. oil companies will flood in and run the country, right? But the reality on the ground is much harsher. The infrastructure of the state oil company has been gutted and neglected for 2 decades, leaving machinery rusted and high-tech human capital having fled abroad. To bring oil production back to pre-crisis levels, we need a massive amount of investment capital and, more importantly, legal stability that a fragile interim government cannot provide overnight. Furthermore, publicizing the desire to seize a sovereign nation's resources is a deadly mistake in strategic communications as it makes us look like invaders. Instead of being welcomed as saving investors, American companies could become targets for sabotage and attacks by nationalist groups or remnants of the old regime wanting to sabotage stabilization efforts. Another aspect often ignored in public discussions is the role of external powers deeply present within Venezuela. We are not just confronting Maduro, we are stepping on the interests of other powers like Russia and China alongside non-state armed groups. Russia has invested billions, and China views this as a key link in their energy and diplomatic strategy in the Western Hemisphere. The United States acting unilaterally and declaring control will certainly trigger geopolitical reactions, not necessarily direct military confrontation, but covert economic and diplomatic sabotage. They could pump money and weapons to opposing factions to turn Venezuela into a quagmire bogging down American power, similar to what we have seen in other proxy hotspots. Strategic naivety in ignoring these variables will make us pay a heavy price when the game involves not just 2 players, Washington and Caracas. Returning to the story of narcotics crime and the charges against Mr. Maduro, we need to clearly distinguish between criminological reality and political tools. Prosecuting a head of state for drug trafficking is an unprecedented step in international law, setting a dangerous new standard. Although experts say Venezuela's role in the global cocaine supply chain is modest compared to production hubs, this accusation is a highly effective political weapon to strip the Maduro regime of legitimacy in the eyes of the American public. However, when we turn the war on drugs into a pretext for regime change, we blur the lines between foreign policy and criminal law enforcement. This could lead to other nations using similar criminal charges to target our officials in the future. We must ask ourselves if arresting Maduro actually reduces the flow of drugs into the United States, or if it merely creates a vacuum for new, more brutal gangs to rise and fight for market share. I also want to add about the reaction of the United States Congress, because this is the key factor deciding the sustainability of any prolonged campaign. The fact that Democratic leaders complained they were kept in the dark about the raid reflects a serious fracture in the national security decision-making process. In a healthy democracy, major military and intelligence operations need consensus, or at least notification to other branches to ensure oversight. When the White House acts so unilaterally, they are betting that success justifies the means, but if the situation deteriorates, they will have no political shield against congressional attack. This internal division weakens the U.S. position internationally because enemies will see us as a divided house and know how to exploit those contradictions. A sustainable foreign policy must be built on bipartisan consensus, not short-term political calculations. Finally, in this expanded analysis, I want to emphasize the human element and social psychology in Venezuela. The Venezuelan people have suffered too much from mismanagement and economic sanctions, and now they are trapped between two fires of an international power conflict. Miss Delcy Rodriguez's change in tone from defiance to reconciliation shows the panic of the ruling class, but it also opens a narrow window for diplomacy if we know how to use it. However, if we continue to threaten and corner them with belligerent statements like running their country, we will inadvertently provoke national pride and turn potential partners into sworn enemies. The lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan are still hot. We cannot impose democracy from the outside through a gun barrel, but must nurture it from within. If the U.S. fails to win the hearts and minds of the Venezuelan people, any lightning military victory will become meaningless. This is not the end of the analysis, because the Venezuela file still contains risks regarding migration and humanitarian crises we haven't touched upon. Millions of Venezuelan refugees are living precariously in neighboring countries, and any new instability could trigger a second wave of migration flooding toward the U.S. border, adding pressure to our already overloaded immigration system. The link between stability in Caracas and the security of the U.S. southern border is more direct and intimate than ever. Therefore, we cannot view this issue in isolation as a distant power game, but must see it as an urgent domestic issue affecting American voters. I will continue to delve into these aspects in subsequent parts so you can have the most comprehensive and realistic picture of the 21st century's biggest gamble in the Western Hemisphere that we have just begun to join